You're listening to the BBC World Service.
Our Washington reporter Anthony Zerka has more.
Our South America correspondent Katie Watson reports from Brazil.
Well, our Europe regional editor Mike Sanders is here in the studio.
Our Americas editor Candace Peart began by telling me about...
On air, online, on smartphone and on smart speaker. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to Newshour from the BBC World Service. I'm James Kimarasamy. On day 5 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we speak to a Ukrainian civilian who's taken up arms to defend his country.
First, there are gunshots. Then there are screams of victims. And then you understand that, okay, this is real.
The UN says that more than 500,000 people have fled Ukraine. We'll hear from the displaced.
We're ashamed. I never thought we'd be in this situation. We were normal people. We had jobs, schools, a normal family. And now we have to ask for help. And the scariest thing is we don't know how long this is for.
Plus, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators begin talks in Belarus. And as Western sanctions begin to hit Russia, what impact could they have on the conflict? All of that coming up after the news.
BBC News with Sue Montgomery. The United Nations Refugee Agency says more than 500,000 refugees from Ukraine have now fled into neighbouring countries following Russia's invasion last week. Ukraine's neighbours to the west have kept their borders open to refugees. Imogen Folks reports from Geneva.
With the invading Russian troops still struggling to gain control of Ukraine's cities, thousands of civilians are trying to escape what could become a bloody fight for every street. Initially, many tried to stay put or move to the Ukrainian countryside. The UN Human Rights Chief today confirmed 102 civilian deaths since the invasion began, but expects the true figure to be much higher. She said most civilians had been killed by explosive weapons with a wide impact area. The implication, the Russians are using indiscriminate force in civilian areas, a potential war crime.
Several cities across Ukraine came under assault overnight, but correspondents on the ground say the attacking Russian forces have met stiff resistance. A Ukrainian government advisor said dozens of civilians had been killed and hundreds wounded in Russian missile strikes on Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv. The U.S. Treasury has blocked Americans from engaging in any transactions involving Russia's central bank, National Wealth Fund and Finance Ministry in further punishment of Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine. Already sanctions are having an impact. The Russian currency, the ruble, has tumbled almost 30% to record lows against the dollar. From Moscow, Jenny Hill.
There isn't a sense of panic here. There is, of course, concern. There have been, as you saw, some lines at some cash points. It's going to take a little while, though, I think, before your average Russian really starts to feel the pinch. Vladimir Putin is currently meeting his economic advisors. The Kremlin, as you know, has been defiant about these sanctions, insisting again today that it was expecting them and it is prepared for them. Mr. Putin appeared before the cameras as that meeting got started, smiling, relaxed, contemptuous even of the sanctions imposed by the West, or as he put it, the empire of lies.
On the 5th day after Russian forces entered Ukraine, delegations from the two countries have begun talks aimed at ending the war. The Ukrainian president's office says it wants an immediate ceasefire and the withdrawal of Russian forces. A Russian negotiator at the talks said Moscow wanted to reach an agreement that was in the interests of both sides. Before the meeting started, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, urged Russian troops to lay down their weapons.
Бросайте вашу технику и уходите.
Drop your weapons and get out of here. Do not believe your commanders. Do not believe your propagandists. Just save your lives and go.
Уходите.
World News from the BBC. A rare emergency session of the UN General Assembly will get underway shortly to discuss the crisis. Correspondents say one ambassador after another is expected to use the world stage to condemn President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It's being seen as a hugely symbolic event. General Assembly special sessions have been held just 10 times in 7 decades. The Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich has said he's accepted a Ukrainian request for his support in achieving a solution to the war in Ukraine. A spokeswoman for the owner of Chelsea Football Club said he'd been trying to help since first being contacted. It said this involvement had prevented Mr. Abramovich, an associate of President Putin for more than 2 decades, from commenting on the situation in Ukraine. The Nigerian president has called for everyone fleeing Ukraine to be treated with dignity and without favour. His comments come after Nigerian students complained they were being prevented by Ukrainian officials from crossing into Poland. Muhammadu Buhari said anyone fleeing a conflict situation had the same right to safe passage under the UN Convention. He said the colour of their passport or their skin should make no difference. In other news, a United Nations report says human-induced climate change is already causing widespread and dangerous disruption, affecting the lives of billions of people. Here's Victoria Gill.
It makes for pretty grim reading. The 35-page summary is a pretty sombre assessment of just how climate change impacts are playing out now. This is not something about projections in the future, it's about the impacts that are happening now. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres described it as an atlas of human suffering. He really pulled no punches in accusing the lack of leadership around the world when it comes to reducing the impacts of climate change. He labelled that as criminal. So this makes for really, really sombre reading.
BBC News.
Hello and welcome to Newshour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from London. I'm James Kamarasamy. On day 5 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we'll get the latest on the fighting, on the negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Belarus, and on the human impact of the war. We'll be hearing from people leaving their homes in Ukraine and from one of those who is determined to stay and fight. And as the Russian ruble plunges, the Russian interest rates double, and trading on the Russian stock market is cancelled, we'll examine the economic impact on Moscow of Western sanctions and hear what the Kremlin is planning to do and say in response. Let's begin, though, with the latest on the ground in Ukraine. Those are the sounds of fighting from Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, in the northeast. There have been reports of heavy shelling and, according to an advisor for the Ukrainian Interior Ministry, large numbers of casualties. In his latest message today, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky called on Russian troops to lay down their arms, and he called for the European Union to take up the issue of Ukraine's membership of the EU without delay.
We
address the European Union to admit Ukraine immediately, according to the new special procedure. We are grateful to the partners that they stand with us, but our goal is to be with all Europeans, and most importantly, to be equal. I'm sure that's fair. I'm sure we deserved it. I'm sure it's possible.
Well, we're looking at the possibilities that are suggested there later on with a European Member of Parliament. But let's start in the capital, Kyiv, where a curfew was lifted this morning. The BBC's James Waterhouse joins us now. So, James, what has it been like today?
It's been, in the relative scheme of things, a better day, I would suggest, for Ukrainians living in the city, but I have to qualify that, as you can appreciate. They emerged this morning from underground shelters, most of them, metro stations, underground car parks in our case, because a curfew had been lifted. Now, the air raid siren has been sounded 3 times this morning. We haven't heard any explosions which usually do follow that, but people have taken the opportunity to move above surface, mostly go to supermarkets and shops, and there were queues stretching back for as far as you could see in some places. Supermarket aisles soon find themselves empty because for most people the priority is replenishing what are increasingly limited stocks, so food, drink, fruit and veg, which, you know, around the 5-day mark of being cut away tends to go off. But it has been a defiant sense of positivity here in the capital, at least. It has been a calm picture. It has been a chance for people to reclaim freedoms that were so abruptly taken away 5 days ago.
Yes, and I appreciate you're in Kyiv and have been hunkered down, James. And what are you hearing about what has been happening in the rest of the country?
Well, there has been, it's been an especially tough day for people in Kharkiv, where there has been intense fighting. There has been a heavy shell attack close to a shopping centre there in the centre of Kharkiv, and this is off the back of a night of shelling and street fighting between Russian and Ukrainian troops. So authorities say dozens of people have been killed, but for now the city holds. But there are concerns about this Russian advance in the south, which is causing Ukrainian forces a lot of problems.
James, thanks very much. James Waterhouse, our correspondent in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Well, after President Zelensky called for a general mobilization of the country, thousands of Ukrainians have signed up to take part in the territorial defense. We're going to hear the experience of one of them now. 29-year-old Alexander usually works as an assistant to the head of an IT company in Kyiv. He told us that last night he picked up a gun and he fought for his country. We can't independently confirm his account, but we do know that civilians have been armed by the Ukrainian government.
Yesterday, when I was in my military base, which is very not far from the center of the city, I think 7 or 7:30 p.m., we heard a car coming kind of near our military base, and people from the car started shooting at our military base, and guys from our base started defending, and in the end there was one dead from the side of the saboteurs, and 2 heavily wounded from our side.
And when you say saboteurs, who were they?
Yeah. Those are the people who are working for Russians. I cannot say that they are Russians. I haven't seen their passports, but definitely they are people who are working in their interests, in interests of people who want to destabilize peace inside the capital of Ukraine.
And you say on your side there were injuries?
Yes, 2 heavily wounded people.
And are they people like you, people who are not professional soldiers?
No, they actually are war veterans, and they've been through war from 2014 to 2017, most of them. They have military experience, but still they got wounded.
What was the experience of last night like for you?
It was loud. It was loud. Because first there are gunshots that are happening right before your ear. Then there are screams of victims. It's extremely loud. It's always scary to hear someone scream. You cannot fake that kind of screaming. Do you know what I mean? That sort of screaming that is coming from an extreme pain, for example, a gunshot wound, or several of them for that matter, that sort of scream kind of wakes you up. It makes you alert. It makes you kind of think straighter. So yes, paradoxically, those things that were happening last night, although in general they were scary, but they were kind of a wake-up call. And then when the stress is going away, then you understand that, okay, this is real. People who are working for Russians, or Russians themselves, are actively working. This is not fair play. They are all for chaos. They are all for destabilizing the peaceful situation.
So what happened to the people who were wounded?
From our side,
yes.
2 heavily wounded, and they were taken to the hospital, and they are being treated as we speak.
And for you, what now? You go out on patrol again, do you?
I am enlisted in territorial defense, and yes, in your words, I am on patrol on the streets. Strangely, it made me feel a bit more courageous and calm in what I'm about to do and do for the next day, week, month, or whatever it's going to happen. We are not fighting by ourselves. This is not a Ukrainian-Russian war. This is a war against oppressive regime that is started as a Russian-Ukrainian war. But now it's a war between Russia and the civilized world.
That was Alexander, a Ukrainian citizen who's taken up arms, one of the volunteers. Well, let's cross live to the capital, Kyiv now. Ina Sovson's a member of parliament with the opposition Holos party. Welcome to the programme.
Good afternoon.
Now, we heard from our correspondent in Kyiv that things are quieter today than they have been. What's your sense of what is happening in and around the capital now?
So the situation in the city itself is indeed more quiet. We did have several air raid sirens blaring during the night time and during the day, but it is much more quiet than the previous days. So basically all the entrances, all the major roads leading towards the city have been blocked by the Ukrainian army, territorial defense, and everyone else involved. So in the city itself, what is basically happening are just the shootings between those what the previous speakers called the saboteurs or the infiltrators that the Russians sent into the cities of Ukraine. So those are the major shootings just happening randomly in different parts of the city. So it is more quiet indeed. The scariest stuff is happening around Kyiv city, with Russians, tank battalions are trying to get closer to the city. As of now, from two main directions, from the north and from the west. So they came from the north and they're now entering from the western side. And there are battles happening over there. Well, we are still waiting for the results of those battles, but that's what we know so far. I think the scariest part is the scariest things are happening in Kharkiv right now. I just watched the video. It is terrifying. It is my native city. I feel so much for the Ukrainians living there, and I believe that when the shelling of Kharkiv is over, which is still taking place right now, we shall get just a terrifying number of casualties among civilian populations, because they're now just shelling their living quarters in Kharkiv.
And what have you made of President Putin's talk in recent days of putting his nuclear deterrence into a new phase, onto higher alert? What has that meant for you in Ukraine?
I think that just reminder for the whole world that Putin is not just a danger to Ukraine. He is actually a threat to the whole world, and no one is safe until Putin is at office and having the power that he has. So we always knew that this nuclear threat was always there. We were always keeping it that on the back of our minds. We still cannot grasp that this is a possibility. I still very much believe that there should be someone sane around him who would prevent from the worst happening. He is clearly upping up his game, and he is clearly trying to threaten, at this point, not just Ukraine, but the whole world. We still hope this is not going to happen. We're still trying to take care of our territory to protect our citizens from shelling. So we hope this is not going to happen, but I really, really ask the whole world to join us in fight against the aggressor for the whole world.
And what are you expecting in Kyiv? Are you expecting, is this a pause in the attempt to take the capital?
Most likely. So most likely that it is a pause. It's a way to win time for the Russian forces, which were suffering very bad losses. So I think they have problems with the motivation and morale among their soldiers, who just refuse to go any further, because they see that anyone who did come closer to the capital, to the city of Kyiv, none of those Russians have returned. And for that reason, I think that they are trying to re-establish morale among their ranks and to make sure that that their soldiers are still willing to fight, because that is not always the case.
Ina.
But we will see how that proceeds.
Ina, thank you very much for joining us. Ina Sovson, member of the Ukrainian Parliament. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is Newshour, coming to you live from London with James Kimarasamy. Coming up later on in the programme, the United Nations says that more than 500,000 refugees have now fled Ukraine for neighbouring countries since the Russian invasion began. We'll hear from the Polish border.
There's box after box of clothing here. Jeans, coats, hats, scarves, picking their way through it are people who've just come through border control. This is the beginning of a new life for many of them. Excuse me, sir, you just come from Ukraine?
Yes.
You need to get some clothes?
Yes.
Because it's cold.
Clothes, t-shirts, and then boots.
And some new shoes or boots.
Shoes.
Oh, well, good luck.
Thank you.
We'll have that full report in about half an hour's time. Other headlines at this hour: the United States has announced further measures aimed at disrupting Russia's economy as the Moscow Stock Exchange fails to open and the value of the ruble plummets. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is Newshour, coming to you live from London with James Kamarasamy. Well, Ukrainian and Russian negotiators have begun talking in the Gomel region of Belarus, near the border of the three countries, and the Ukrainians have called for an immediate ceasefire and the withdrawal of all Russian forces. Moscow, meanwhile, is saying in rather more vague terms that it wants to reach an agreement in the interests of both sides. Let's have an assessment of these talks, what they might bring. Joining us is Katerina Volchuk, Professor of Eastern European Politics at the University of Birmingham here in England. She's also Associate Fellow of the Chatham House International Affairs think tank's Russia and Eurasia programme. Welcome to NewsHour.
Hello.
And what can we take from these talks, the fact that they're happening in the first place?
Yes, in a way they have to happen because Ukrainians want ceasefire, Ukrainians want the Russian troops out of Ukraine, but it seems that while the talks have been taking place, there are lots of reports in Ukraine of shelling of Ukrainian cities, including civilian parts of the city in Kharkov. So while there were negotiations, there is no sign whatsoever that Russia actually wants to ceasefire and to withdraw. So what we've been saying from the Russian representative, that it has to work for both sides, it seems they want a settlement which allows President Putin to be able to claim victory.
And what's your assessment of how the Russian military campaign is going?
There are lots of question marks, because we know, for example, that Russia didn't spend very much in comparison to the West on propping up the Russian economy during the pandemic. They really economized safe, and it seems they pumped money into the military. So they've been a lot of spending, not least in the last 2 years, and it seems that the Russian army is underperforming. And why is this the question? There's obviously this issue of motivation, that, asymmetry of motivation, that Ukrainians are defending their homeland, whereas Russians, many of them, those which were captured, they say they didn't know what they were going for. So the alternative reality created in Russia seems to that was what the Russian soldiers were told, and when they're confronted with the realities on the ground and the hostility of the Ukrainians, that really has a demoralizing effect. On the other hand, other people say, and that it's not over. Putin really wanted to use limited military capacities, just enough to subjugate Ukraine without actually claiming it's a war. So now we may be entering into a much violent escalation when the Russian army throws at Ukraine all its capabilities.
And briefly, what about the role of the hosts of these talks, Belarus? Because they are very much seen as being, the closest, certainly in physical terms, ally of President Putin at the moment.
Yes and no. In many respects, President Lukashenko is literally, as we say, in Putin's pocket, because he's so discredited, and he's basically, as it is said, has blood on his hands. So he's acting as a puppet in Putin's hand. But this cannot be said about Belarusian society. For them, going into war against Ukraine is inconceivable. So Ukraine protested, they didn't want to go to Belarus. It seems that they did it, but in terms of actual Belarus. Belarus doesn't represent an independent party, at least the Belarusian authorities. As there are a lot of speculation whether the Belarusian army will be sent to Ukraine, but I would say there is basically a limited chance they will be fighting against Ukrainians.
Katerina Volchuk, thanks very much. Well, in eastern Ukraine, the latest fighting has led to thousands of people fleeing their homes, but as our correspondent Sarah Rainsford now reports from the city of Dnipro, there are fewer places in the region that now feel safe.
Before this war, Maxim went to nursery, his mum had a job, and the whole family had a home in Volnovakha. Then Russian troops started to advance through Ukraine. Maxim's family have ended up right on the eastern front line. Nadezhda tells me she held out until a shell hit their neighbour's barn. A few metres further left, and she and the family wouldn't be here. They spent hours that night crouched in the bathroom for safety. The next morning, Nadezhda gathered up her family and fled. They're now in a student hostel here, living off handouts.
We're ashamed. I never thought we'd be in this situation. We were normal people. We had jobs, schools, a normal family. And now we have to ask for help. And the scariest thing is we don't know how long this is for, and whether we will have anything left to go back to.
Her friend Ludmila tells me whenever a door bangs, she thinks it's an explosion and that she should grab the children and run for cover. Nadezhda spends a lot of time now scrolling through her phone, anxious for news of friends and relatives she left behind. She tells me she feels guilty every day. There's a chat group that people post to when they emerge from their bunkers to check the bomb damage before darting back underground. We can't get near Volnovakha safely now, but these stories are a reminder of the fierce fighting here in the east, and that Russian forces are gaining ground. As the children run rings around a table piled with donated biscuits and pickles and buckwheat, I meet Yelena, who tells me Ukraine will win this war. When I counter that I'm afraid Vladimir Putin hasn't even started yet, Yelena ticks me off. Just let him try, she tells me. But across town, more volunteers are greeting more families seeking shelter, this time in a bar. The concert hall upstairs has been carpeted with soft mats, and there are piles of donated clothes and toys for the children. As we were talking to one family here, another one just came through the door with all their bags and their belongings, and with their dog, a black collie. There's a little girl in front of me as well, rolling around on a play mat, who's hugging a grey cat called Sima, that she said she couldn't leave at home. Natalia lived right near the Russian border and fled with her children as soon as the town came under attack. Her 14-year-old son had to drive them. Her mother has just arrived at the shelter with news that key spots along the way have fallen to Russian forces. When I ask Natalia how she's coping, her eyes fill with tears. I try to keep it together, she tells me, because I don't want my children to see me cry. But she says she's still in shock that this war is even happening, and angry at Vladimir Putin.
He says he's defending us, but who from? By burning down our houses and our land?
I ask if she feels safer now in Dnipro.
For now, yes, it's calm here, but my heart is shattered. My family has been pulled apart, and I'm frightened for my children. I just really want this to end. It's a nightmare.
But the danger is following her. As we finished speaking, an air raid siren wailed across Dnipro for the first time, and a whole city, adults, children and their pets, were driven underground.
Sarah Rainsford reporting from Dnipro in central Ukraine. You're listening to Newshour from the BBC World Service.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and for the next World Book Club, Kylie Reid joins Harriet Gilbert to talk about Such a Fun Age.
I wanted to use familiar stereotypes, but twist and bend them a bit.
It's a story about race, class, and the delicate relationship between a mother and a babysitter.
Alex often felt that Amira saw her as a textbook rich white person, much in the same way that Alex saw many of the annoying Upper East Side moms that she and her girlfriends had always tried to avoid. But if Amira would only take a deeper look, if she gave Alex a chance, Alex knew that she would begin to think otherwise. As an author, I think it's great fun to put two people in a room, one of them who only thinks everything is her fault, and the other one who just wants to be best friends, which makes it a very awkward situation for everyone.
The young American author Kylie Reid will be joining me to talk about Such a Fun Age.
World Book Club, Saturday at 12 GMT.
Coming up on Newshour in the next 30 minutes, we go to Moscow, where the ruble has plunged after Western sanctions on Russian banks. We'll hear from Berlin, where Germany has promised to overturn decades of defence policy to support Ukraine. We'll be hearing from Ukraine's border with Poland, where refugees are fleeing the country, and the UN's latest report on the state of the climate. All of that after the news.
BBC News. The UN Refugee Agency says more than 500,000 refugees from Ukraine have now fled into neighbouring countries following Russia's invasion last week. About half of that number have headed for Poland, which said most were being allowed in, including people without documentation. Ukraine's neighbours to the west have kept their borders open to refugees. Several cities across Ukraine came under assault overnight, but correspondents on the ground say the attacking Russian forces have met stiff resistance. A Ukrainian government advisor said dozens of civilians had been killed and hundreds wounded in Russian missile strikes on Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv. The US Treasury has blocked Americans from engaging in any transactions involving Russia's central bank, National Wealth Fund, and Finance Ministry. The US said the latest sanctions were likely to drive Russia's inflation higher and damage its purchasing power. Russia and Ukraine are holding face-to-face talks for the first time since President Putin's forces invaded 5 days ago. Ukraine's delegates said they want an immediate ceasefire and withdrawal of troops from their territory. Russia has talked of a deal that's in the interests of both sides. A rare emergency session of the UN General Assembly will get underway shortly to discuss the crisis. Correspondents say one ambassador after another is expected to use the world stage to condemn President Putin's invasion. In other news, a UN report says human-induced climate change is already causing widespread and dangerous disruption, affecting the lives of billions of people. The study says the people and ecosystems least able to cope are being hit hardest. The trial of an Israeli police officer who shot dead an autistic Palestinian man is in its second day. The officer mistook the man for a terrorist. BBC News.
Coming up next, we'll look at the impact of the invasion of Ukraine on the Russian economy. First, though, another long-term threat that has been brought into focus today, because many of the impacts of global warming are now simply irreversible, according to the UN's latest assessment. Although the authors of the new report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change say there is still a brief window of time to avoid the very worst. Let's speak to environment correspondent Matt McGrath. Matt, so what are the main findings of this latest in what is a series of reports, isn't it?
That's right, Jamie. It is a series of reports. We had the first one last August explaining how humans are impacting the climate. Well, this one shows how that climate, that changed climate, is impacting humans and all other species on the planet. One of the people today said we're in an emergency heading for disaster, and this report is a long and grim litany, I would say, of impacts that are currently hitting the world and humans and species, and also likely to hit in the coming decades. And as I said, it's a rather grim, harrowing catalogue of impacts that are affecting all of us across the world. People in poorer places are much worse than people in richer countries.
Yeah, and it's about crops, it's about glaciers, it's about the environment at large, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it covers everything from humans, people dying from heat waves, people in parts of Africa, Asia, South and Central America, 15 times more likely to die in storms and wind and droughts over the last 10 years than people in other parts of the world. It also focuses on species. They say that half the species assessed are moving. They're moving towards the poles, or they're moving up mountains. They're moving to get away from the impacts of warming. So these are things that are happening right now all over the world, and this report, as I said, catalogues and captures that.
It does also look to solutions, mitigations, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's the authors, I would say, are relatively hopeful that things can be done, but the window of opportunity, as they say, is closing rapidly. They talk about spending huge amounts on adaptation, helping countries to adapt, build seawalls, do that sort of thing. But you have to be careful what you do. You don't want to. They point out that some of the adaptations that are taking place up to now have actually made things worse. They talk about loss and damage. These are the impacts that countries can't adapt to. They want to see progress on that. But I think overall they want to see that as the world goes forward in the next number of years, they want countries to spend money on healthcare, on education, on social justice. Those things, they believe, are critical to helping the world to cope with the impacts of climate change. We may not be able to stop those impacts, but by spending money in this climate resilient way, we'll be able to mitigate some of the worst impacts.
And very briefly, Matt, I mean, what impact does all this have on these large international gatherings where all this is hammered out?
Yeah, it's 3 months since the COP26 negotiations. I think this report will put loss and damage right at the heart of those negotiations, which will happen in Sharm el-Sheikh later this year.
Matt, thanks very much. The BBC's Matt McGrath on that latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You're listening to the BBC World Service, and this is Newshour, coming to you live from London with James Kamarasamy. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is Newshour. We're live in London, and 5 days into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Moscow is increasingly being cut off from the Western world, both economically and culturally. Well, there's now tough Western sanctions on the Russian economy, which are having a direct impact on people there, including these folks on the streets of Moscow.
Our economic situation will get a lot worse. It's inevitable in these circumstances, but it's still not comparable with the people who are dying in their homes through the fault of our forces. We're in touch with our Ukrainian friends, and I have no words that could comfort them.
I don't have any hard currency savings. Let's see what happens.
Well, let's cross to the Russian capital and speak to the BBC's Jenny Hill, who's there. So, Jenny, what are we seeing in practical terms today?
Well, as you know, the day began pretty badly for the Russian economy. The ruble hit a record low. The stock market here hasn't opened at all today, and the central bank has more than doubled its key interest rate. So in terms of the big picture, it's pretty bad. In terms of how average Russians are being affected, we have seen some queues at some cash points in recent days. We're not seeing a run on the banks or anything like that yet. That would be very much overblowing the current picture. I think right now, most average Russians aren't noticing a great deal of difference. That is, of course, extremely likely to change. Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin are very keen, I think, to peddle the narrative that everything is going to be okay. We heard from the Kremlin this afternoon insisting that Russia was expecting these sanctions, it's prepared for these sanctions, and it has the ability to compensate for these sanctions. That's the official line. Vladimir Putin has been meeting with his economic advisors this afternoon. Some of the pictures from the meetings are interesting because the economic advisors look really quite concerned. But Vladimir Putin himself was smiling, very nonchalant at the beginning of the meeting, which was televised partially, and actually almost contemptuous of sanctions imposed by the West, or as he calls it, the empire of lies. State television is at pains to make sure that people feel reassured and to peddle the same line from the Kremlin. And so it will be interesting to see what happens and how quickly it begins to affect your average Russian. One interesting development, though, is that, what about these oligarchs, the wealthy tycoons who have influence with Mr. Putin? For the first time, we've heard from one, Oleg Deripaska. He has voiced his discontent and expressed concerns about the economy, saying it needs to change, and wanting to know from officials what the economy is going to do over the next few months.
And briefly, interesting, another well-known oligarch, Roman Abramovich, apparently being asked to intervene in terms of negotiations.
Oh, now that's interesting. That's a new one on me. I did not know that. The negotiations are a really interesting point, though, because, as you know, the Russians have been very keen to have these peace talks in Belarus, knowing that the Ukrainians were not keen on coming to Belarus for peace talks, albeit near the border. There are other options on the table, too. Azerbaijan, Turkey, Israel. Many people have offered to mediate and host talks. Russia, though, has been, very insistent on these talks in Belarus. It's not a neutral country in this conflict by any stretch, so it'll be very interesting to see what actually emerges in concrete terms, both from the talks today and where any kind of diplomacy goes, if it goes anywhere at all.
Jenny, thanks very much. Jenny Hildair speaking to us from Moscow. Well, joining us now is Vladislav Inozemtsev, Director for the Center for Post-Industrial Studies, the author of a recent article entitled "How Long Can Russia's Economy Hold Out?", which was written for the independent news publication Riddle, and he joins us on the line from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the programme.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, what is the answer? How long can Russia's economy hold out?
Look, I think that under the sanctions of such a magnitude that were imposed yesterday and on Friday, not so long. Because what was absolutely unexpected to me was the blocking of the central bank's accounts, because the reserves of the central bank, they are quite vast, quite big. It's around $650 billion, but most of them are deposited in Western banks or invested in Western securities or state bonds. And so therefore, if these assets are blocked, the central bank can intervene to support the ruble. And this was the case of today, because last Thursday, when Putin launched his attack on Ukraine, central bank was actually close to as one sole seller of the dollars on the stock exchange, on the currency exchange in Moscow, and at that time it was quite successful to push the exchange rate down, but not today.
Well, what we've seen happen today is increased rates, interest rates double to 20%. What difference can that make, and can that be sustained?
Look, it can be sustained for several months, and it was like the same in 2014 when it reacted to the first war in Ukraine. But the problem is that the Central Bank of Russia doesn't command a lot of a huge money supply. Look, if one considers the assets of the Central Bank of Russia, they're quite interesting, because 81% of all the assets of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation were the foreign currency reserves, compared to 3.5% as the Federal Reserve in the United States. So the Russian Central Bank was actually acting like, a depositor for dollars and an issuer for rubles, which were covered by its reserves. Reserves are blocked. The central bank is absolutely unexperienced in quantitative easing. So anyway, and the inflation in Russia, it doesn't, be of monetary nature, because the state raises tariffs and prices, and so therefore it's impossible to combat inflation with high interest rates. But the high interest rates will affect all the economy, the mortgage market will falter, all these new expenses would be counted in, the costs for another production. So this will be
sorry, don't have too much time. I just wonder, what about China? Could it prop up the Russian economy?
No, not at all. The Central Bank of Russia has invested a lot of money into the Chinese securities, into yuan assets, around 14 or 15% of all its reserves. But this money can be used only for financing bilateral trade.
if you want to sell the yuan, the renminbi for dollars, you should have the active account to put the dollars in, and this is not the case.
Right. So just for ordinary Russians, then, so far not a huge impact on them. But what do you think they can do, will do, to try and avoid the impact of the sanctions?
Look, now I would say nothing, because before I had advised many times, speaking of the Russian media, that in these times you should buy dollars, put it in cash under your pillow, and this is the only solution, because it might be the situation when the Russian banks will convert the dollar deposits into ruble ones, because look, in the central bank they have $32 billion or euros in cash. The dollar and euro denominated deposits of the Russian public in the Russian bank is around $85 billion. So the central bank cannot produce enough cash money for settling all the deposit operations. So this might result in forced conversion into Russian rubles.
Vladislav, I'm afraid we have to leave it there, but thank you so much. Vladislav Inozemtsev, Director for the Centre for Post-Industrial Studies. Now, Ukraine's call for immediate membership of the EU, which we heard at the beginning of the programme, might have seemed fanciful even a week ago, but the past 5 days have seen some pretty abrupt shifts in European policy. Perhaps nowhere is this more significant than in Germany, which has dropped its long-standing objection to sending weapons to conflict zones. It's significantly increasing its defence spending as well. Joining us now is Thomas Erndl, member of the opposition CSU party. He's a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the German Parliament. Welcome to Newshour. And I wonder, what took Germany so long, I suppose many will be asking?
Oh, that is a good question. And I think it was a hard discussion, but I'm really glad that we saw now this historic policy shift in Germany this weekend, and I think it was absolutely the right decision that we reversed the policy of not sending weapons and are now actively supporting the Ukraine.
And what happens to this request for EU membership? There's been some positive noises, I think, from the Czech Republic. Is this a possibility? Can it be rushed through?
Not sure. I think in these days it's really important to support the Ukraine with whatever they need now, and this is the support on the weapons, but this is also the sanctions. We were also inert, and it always was said Germany too little too late, but I think we did also the right move here with fully supporting SWIFT and all the other sanctions, and everything else I think is then something we need to discuss after the current urgent crisis, I would say.
Do you think the former Chancellor Angela Merkel will be reflecting on the role she has played, on the fact that she has not taken these kind of measures in the past, and perhaps might have been able to head off something like this if Germany had been more forceful as it is being now?
Well, I mean, of course you need to have a critical view backwards, but I think it was not just Angela Merkel, it were basically many politicians. Chancellor Schröder is really in a very, how can I say, unlucky role, and therefore,
well,
it's
yes,
basically
a former chancellor who, on the Gazprom board, who's been very closely involved with Russia, from the Social Democrats,
which is absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah,
so
should he resign now, do you think?
Absolutely, and the Social Democrats should throw him out of the party, because I mean, at the end, Gazprom is now a company which finances a aggressive war, and therefore it cannot be a partner anymore to anybody. And we have to consider that. And of course, there need to be a critical look back. But I think most important is that we did the right shift on time.
So what else can Germany do now? You've taken this very symbolic decision on providing weapons. What more can Germany do?
Well, I think we are the biggest country in Europe, and therefore it's important that we also lead in foreign and security policy, because we were always behind and partners were urging us, well, the strongest shoulders have to carry more than the others. And I think this is important now to implement. I mean, we did now the message, 100 billions in spending in the army, in the defense budget, but we now need to implement it, that we really have a strong army, that we really can fulfill our duties, that we really can fulfill what we need to contribute to NATO and what the Europeans expect from us.
Thomas, beg your pardon, thank you so much for joining us. Thomas Erndl there, German Member of Parliament. You're listening to NewsHour.
This is the BBC World Service, where we're looking at human nature.
I'm Dessa, the host of Deeply Human, a guided tour through the wilderness inside your head. An investigation of human instinct, culture, and biology to find out why we do what we do. This week, dancing. From rain dances to raves. Why do our bodies react to rhythm?
You will experience that point where you just completely leave your body. It's like I'm at another location in the room, and then I'm watching myself dance.
Why does music move us?
I moved a little easier and lighter, and I felt a little lighter. Dance is both therapy and a way to elevate my spirits.
I'm looking at the neuroscience of music and movement.
The connections in our brain can synchronize their firing to musical beats. When we move, we tend to connect to the sounds and to the vibrations.
Deeply Human at bbcworldservice.com/deeplyhuman.
Reminder of our top story at this hour, a programme which of course is dominated by events in Ukraine after the Russian invasion. 29-year-old Alexander in Kyiv has been speaking to us. He picked up a gun last night to defend his country.
That sort of screaming that is coming from a gunshot wound, or several of them for that matter, that sort of scream kind of wakes you up. And then when the stress is going away, then you understand that, okay, this is real. The Russians themselves are actively working. This is not fair play. They are all for chaos.
One other headline, the United States has announced further measures aimed at disrupting Russia's economy as the Moscow Stock Exchange fails to open and the value of the ruble plummets. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour, coming to you live from London with James Kamarasamy. The United Nations says that more than 500,000 refugees have now fled Ukraine for neighbouring countries since the Russian invasion began. EU officials believe that the number could rise to over 7 million in what could be the largest humanitarian crisis on the European continent in years. The BBC's Nick Robinson has travelled from the Ukrainian capital Kyiv to the Polish border, and he's been speaking to people who have been making the same journey.
So there's a soldier here now, forcing people into line. And the people who are here, they are in fact united in a desperation to escape this war.
Mr. Putin put everyone on a hot spot. I mean, everybody now is a refugee here, whether you're a foreigner living in Ukraine or a Ukrainian.
Just over the border, there are great sacks of food here for people who are coming from Ukraine. There's pasta, sugar, flour, biscuits, all the things that people coming would need when they arrive here. And across the road are great piles of second-hand clothes that people can pick up to give to their children, because all they've got is what they can shove into 1 or 2 suitcases.
We know that some people are, not from Ukraine, so we make both cheese and ham and even chocolate sandwiches for the kids, so trying to put a little smile on their face. Everything that is here is basically donated from people from all over Poland and from Ukrainians from Poland also.
And is there a real welcome? Because sometimes people are not so welcoming to refugees.
It's, I think, easily understood here in Poland that Poles and Ukrainians are brothers and sisters, so that's the case.
There's box after box after box of clothing here. Jeans, coats, hats, scarves, all the lot. And picking their way through it are people who've just come through border control. This is the beginning of a new life for many of them, and what will protect them during this winter. Excuse me, sir? You just come from Ukraine?
Yes.
you need to get some clothes.
Yes.
Because it's cold.
Clothes, t-shirts, and then a boot.
And some new shoes or boots.
Shoes.
Oh, well, good luck.
Thank you.
It says on your badge, stand with Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, a lot of people come in here and they don't have where to stay. So I'm helping with coordinating where they need to go.
And where will they live, the people who are coming, just walking down this hill? They've just come through passport control. Where will they live?
For now, a lot of Ukrainians also help in Poland. People helps giving to people, and also they are looking for the job for them.
This shanty town of stalls, and yes, the warm welcome, represents the end of a long, long journey for many who fought to get out of Ukraine. Not just dodging the bombs and the bullets in the capital city, but queuing, walking for hour after painful hour before waiting in the bitterly cold weather to make their way through border control. Now they are free, but they're away from home. And many fear, many know, it may be a very long time before they go back again.
That was the BBC's Nick Robinson reporting from the Ukrainian border with Poland. Well, let's speak now to Matthew Saltmarsh, spokesperson for the United Nations Refugee Agency. Welcome to the programme.
Good afternoon.
The number, more than 500,000 already. Where do you expect this to go?
Well, as you said, the number has been rising very quickly throughout the days of this crisis. We're now at about 500,000. Over half of those are in Poland, but there are also significant numbers in Hungary, Moldova, Slovakia, and also some movement onto other countries in Europe. We don't have a forecast for where it will go. Our planning suggests that it could be up to 4 million. That's what we're planning for, and we'll release an appeal actually with UN partners in the next days to try and raise some money for that. But we're aware, of course, that there's a range of estimates and that the EU have said that it could be even higher, the numbers.
And are these neighbouring countries prepared, perhaps more so than they might have been for other flows of refugees, given the history of the past 8 years?
Well, I think preparations were made, importantly, in the weeks preceding the conflict. And as you'll have seen and been hearing, shelter is being provided primarily in civic centres in many cases. And also food and water is there, and the means of people to keep warm and healthy. So I think initially, obviously, we're very thankful for those countries for opening their borders. Obviously, we'll have to see where things go from now. A lot depends on the conflict, the duration, the intensity, and also what happens at the EU level, how the EU decides to handle this crisis.
What are you looking out for then? What, in terms of your planning, what are the key things in that form of negotiation that you're looking out for?
Well, we're looking on two sides. First of all, within Ukraine, where, of course, there's significant displacement. And there we have people in the country. We have 6 offices. We have over 100 staff. But, of course, it's very difficult right now with the conflict being so active for them to get out. Some of them have been trying to get out to do monitoring and provide some assistance. But given the security situation, that's not easy right now. And then the second part, of course, is in those neighboring countries. And there it's working with those national authorities, providing them with logistical support and helping to bring in supplies as needed. And also, if needed, to do what we call protection work, which is helping with documentation and in some cases with counselling and things like that.
It's interesting when you hear someone like the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban, who has traditionally not been someone who has welcomed migrants to his country, saying everyone is welcome. Does this feel like a different sort of crisis?
Maybe different from a European perspective, but when you look globally, a refugee crisis is a refugee crisis. There are 26 million refugees around the world, 84 or so million people forcibly displaced. So if you're looking at this crisis from Europe, yes, it can feel very close. It's your neighbours. But when you look at it globally, this is a global problem, the forced displacement issue.
It's a global problem, but of course it's an individual problem for those who are forced to leave their homes in terms of what they need, what kind of support they need. What are the key things?
Well, the key things really are, in the immediate term, is just making sure that people are safe, that they have shelter, that they're warm, that they have food, and that their medical needs are met. That's the situation we're in now. As things progress, you obviously have to think about how people will stay longer term, whether potentially, and again, this is up to the EU, whether people might move to different places, whether different means of integration and support are in place. I think right now it's probably too early to speculate about that, and right now the focus is very much on those border areas and getting that humanitarian aid into those people in dire need.
Matthew Saltmarsh, spokesman for the United Nations Refugee Agency, thanks very much for joining us. And that brings us to an end of this edition of NewsHour. I'll be back with you tomorrow, but for now, from me, James Kamarasamy, and the rest of the team here in London, thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and here's what's happening in the studio this week.
Twyla Tharp is a legend among dancer choreographers, and she's still working, aged 80. We join her as her new sold-out show opens in New York, and we find out about her philosophy of dance.
In the studio, Tuesday at 11:30 and 23:30 GMT. And in 60 minutes, it's OS.
On the 5th day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, people in the capital Kyiv are emerging from a weekend-long curfew. We'll hear their experiences as they're now able to go outside, shop for food and check their properties while the fighting continues.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. I'm James Kamarasamy. On day 5 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we speak to a Ukrainian civilian who's taken up arms to defend his country.
First, there are gunshots. Then there are screams of victims. And then you understand that, okay, this is real.
The UN says that more than 500,000 people have fled Ukraine. We'll hear from the displaced.
We're ashamed. I never thought we'd be in this situation. We were normal people. We had jobs, schools, a normal family. And now we have to ask for help. And the scariest thing is we don't know how long this is for.
Plus, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators begin talks in Belarus. And as Western sanctions begin to hit Russia, what impact could they have on the conflict? All of that coming up after the news.
BBC News with Sue Montgomery. The United Nations Refugee Agency says more than 500,000 refugees from Ukraine have now fled into neighbouring countries following Russia's invasion last week. Ukraine's neighbours to the west have kept their borders open to refugees. Imogen Folks reports.
With the invading Russian troops still struggling to gain control of Ukraine's cities, thousands of civilians are trying to escape what could become a bloody fight for every street. Initially, many tried to stay put or move to the Ukrainian countryside. The UN Human Rights Chief today confirmed 102 civilian deaths since the invasion began, but expects the true figure to be much higher. She said most civilians had been killed by explosive weapons with a wide impact area. The implication, the Russians are using indiscriminate force in civilian areas, a potential war crime.
The US Treasury has blocked Americans from engaging in any transactions involving Russia's central bank, National Wealth Fund and Finance Ministry in further punishment of Moscow for its invasion of Ukraine. US officials said the latest financial measures are likely to drive Russian inflation higher and damage its purchasing power. Several cities across Ukraine came under assault overnight, but correspondents on the ground say the attacking Russian forces have met stiff resistance. A Ukrainian government advisor said dozens of civilians had been killed and hundreds wounded in Russian missile strikes on Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, is in Kyiv.
This has been a very, very hard 36 hours for the residents of this capital. They emerged from their underground shelters, basements and bunkers and bomb shelters, where they'd spent the last 36 hours under a very strict curfew. There was a race to the shops, a race to their homes, a race to find out what was happening in a city which has been transformed every day into a war city.
A rare emergency session of the UN General Assembly is getting underway to discuss the Ukraine crisis. Correspondents say that one ambassador after another is likely to use the world stage to condemn President Putin's invasion. Ahead of the summit, Duncan Kennedy is watching.
Only 10 of these sessions have ever taken place in the past 72 years. It's all come about because last Friday, Russia vetoed a resolution in the Security Council, and that really angered the Americans. So with other nations, they've now pushed through this idea of an emergency session of the General Assembly. Russia tried to block it, tried to veto that, but it was outvoted. It couldn't block it, so it's going ahead today.
World News from the BBC. Russia says it has closed its airspace to planes from 36 countries, including many in Europe, in response to sanctions banning Russian aircraft. Russia said its Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, was cancelling his visit to the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva because of the flight ban. Russia and Ukraine are holding face-to-face talks for the first time since President Putin's forces invaded 5 days ago. Ukraine's delegates have said they want an immediate ceasefire and withdrawal of troops from their territory. Russia's negotiators have talked of a deal that's in the interests of both sides. But Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said he's sceptical that there will be progress. In other news, a UN report says human-induced climate change is already causing widespread and dangerous disruption, affecting the lives of billions of people. Here's our science correspondent, Victoria Gill.
The report makes for pretty grim reading. The 35-page summary is a pretty sombre assessment of just how climate change impacts are playing out now. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres described it as an atlas of human suffering. He really pulled no punches in accusing the lack of leadership around the world when it comes to reducing the impacts of climate change. He labelled that as criminal. Some of the headlines are that there's a new number put on the number of people around the world who are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. 40% of the global population now classed as highly vulnerable.
Residents in Hong Kong are stripping shops of essential supplies after the government said it might confine people to their homes to control the coronavirus. It had previously said it would not impose this extreme measure. Hong Kong reported more than 100 COVID deaths on Monday. Next month, all of Hong Kong's 7 million residents will be tested 3 times to help control the current outbreak. BBC News.